The pain was unbearable, but it was nothing compared to the humiliation. The nurse laughed at my accent while I fought to bring my son into this world. "You can't even speak properly," she said, rolling her eyes. I was vulnerable, scared, alone in that moment. But then my husband arrived, and when she saw his badge, her face went pale. What happened next changed everything. I never thought I'd end up here, in this country, in this life. When I was growing up, home was a small house with terracotta tiles and walls that held decades of family memories. The sun was relentless there, beating down on dusty streets where children played soccer until their mothers called them in for dinner. My childhood smelled like my mother's cooking, slow-roasted meats and handmade tortillas that she'd pat between her palms until they were perfectly round. Every Sunday, our extended family gathered around a long wooden table that my grandfather had built with his own hands. We'd eat for hours, laughing, arguing, telling stories that had been told 100 times before, but somehow never got old. My father worked construction, leaving before dawn and returning after sunset, his hands rough and calloused, his back bent from years of labor. My mother sold tamales at the local market, waking up at 4 in the morning to prepare them, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and that felt like enough. When I was 16, I started learning English, not in school, where the classes were overcrowded and the teachers exhausted, but on my own, hunched over a borrowed laptop in the public library, watching old American TV shows with subtitles. I repeated phrases over and over, trying to wrap my tongue around sounds that felt foreign and strange. My friends thought I was crazy. "Why do you want to go there?" they'd ask. "You'll just be another immigrant cleaning houses." But I had this dream, this stubborn, persistent dream, that maybe, just maybe, I could build something better. Not because I didn't love my home, I did, desperately, but because I wanted more. I wanted opportunities that didn't exist where I was. I wanted to walk into a room and not have my future already decided by where I was born. When I turned 22, I made the decision. It wasn't easy. My mother cried for days and my father barely spoke to me, his silence heavy with disappointment and fear. But I had saved every peso I could, sold everything I owned, and bought a one-way ticket. The day I left, my mother pressed a small silver cross into my palm. "Keep this with you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "And remember, you always have a home here." I nodded, tears streaming down my face, knowing that leaving felt like betraying everyone I loved, but also knowing that staying would mean betraying myself. The first year in the United States was brutal. I lived in a tiny apartment with 3 other women, all of us crowded into a space barely big enough for one person. We shared a bathroom, a kitchen the size of a closet, and dreams that felt too big for the walls around us. I worked at a diner during the day, serving breakfast to truckers and businessmen who barely glanced at me, and cleaned offices at night, scrubbing toilets and emptying trash cans while the city slept. My hands were constantly raw, my back ached, and I was so tired that sometimes I'd fall asleep on the bus ride home, waking up 3 stops past my destination. My English was still rough, all hard edges and misplaced words. People corrected me constantly, often impatiently, like my accent was an inconvenience they had to endure. Some were kind about it, gently guiding me toward the right pronunciation. Others weren't. I remember one customer at the diner, a middle-aged woman with perfectly styled hair who sighed loudly when I struggled to understand her order. "Can someone who speaks English take my table?" she asked, not even looking at me. I smiled, nodded, and walked away, my cheeks burning with shame, but I kept going. I took English classes at the community center, free lessons taught by volunteers who actually cared. I made friends with other immigrants, people who understood what it felt like to be caught between two worlds, not quite belonging to either. We celebrated holidays together, Thanksgiving dinners where none of us really knew what we were doing, Christmas parties where we mixed traditions from a dozen different countries. Those moments felt sacred, like we were building our own version of home in a place that often felt cold and unwelcoming. Then I met Michael. It was at a community event, one of those neighborhood gatherings where they set up folding tables in a park and everyone brings food. I had made empanadas, my mother's recipe, and was nervously arranging them on a platter when he walked up. He was tall, with kind eyes and a smile that made me feel instantly at ease. "Those look amazing," he said, reaching for one. "What are they?" I explained, stumbling over the words, and he listened, really listened, like what I was saying mattered. We talked for hours that day, about everything and nothing, and when he asked for my number, I gave it to him without hesitation. Michael was different from anyone I'd ever met. He didn't care about my accent. In fact, he said he loved the way I pronounced certain words, the way my voice lilted on certain syllables. He was patient with me, never rushing me when I searched for the right word, never making me feel less than. He was a police officer, someone who had chosen to serve and protect, and that kindness extended to everyone he met, including me. We dated for 2 years, and in that time, I fell completely in love with him, not just with who he was, but with how he made me feel safe, valued, seen. We got married on a crisp autumn day, surrounded by his family and the small group of friends I'd made. His mother hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe, whispering, "Welcome to our family." I cried, overwhelmed by the acceptance, by the feeling that maybe, finally, I belonged somewhere. When I found out I was pregnant a year later, I thought I had everything I'd ever dreamed of. A husband who loved me, a future that felt bright, a chance to give my child the opportunities I'd fought so hard to find. But pregnancy was harder than I expected. From the very beginning, I was exhausted, nauseous, constantly uncomfortable. My back ached, my feet swelled, and I couldn't sleep more than a few hours at a time. Michael tried to help, rubbing my feet, making me tea, holding my hair back when the morning sickness hit. But he worked long hours, often night shifts, and there were times when I felt completely alone, my body doing something I couldn't control, something that scared me more than I wanted to admit. At 37 weeks, the contraction started. It was the middle of the night, around 2 a.m, and I woke up to a sharp, stabbing pain in my lower back. At first, I thought it was just the usual pregnancy discomfort, but then another contraction hit, stronger, more intense, and I knew. This was it. My baby was coming. I reached for my phone and called Michael. It rang once, twice, 3 times, then went to voicemail. I tried again, my hands shaking, my breathing ragged, still no answer. He was working, I knew that, probably in the middle of something he couldn't step away from. But in that moment, I needed him more than I'd ever needed anyone. I called again, left a frantic message, my voice breaking with pain and fear. Then I called 911. The ambulance arrived within 10 minutes, lights flashing, sirens wailing. The paramedics were kind, efficient, asking me questions I could barely focus on. They loaded me onto a stretcher and drove me to the nearest hospital, the one Michael and I had toured months ago, the one where we'd planned for everything to go smoothly. But nothing about that night went according to plan. The emergency room was chaos. People everywhere shouting, crying, machines beeping, doctors running from room to room. I was wheeled through the noise, clutching my belly, trying to breathe through the contractions that were coming faster and faster now. Eventually, they took me to a delivery room, a small space with 2 bright lights and sterile white walls. I lay on the bed, alone, terrified, my phone clutched in my hand, waiting for Michael to call back. That's when she walked in. The nurse, tall, blonde, with a face that looked like it had never smiled genuinely in its life. She glanced at me with the kind of expression you'd give a stain on your shoe, something inconvenient and mildly disgusting. She didn't introduce herself, didn't ask how I was feeling, just started checking monitors and adjusting equipment with bored efficiency. I tried to explain what I was feeling, the pain, the pressure, the overwhelming fear, but the words came out jumbled. English and Spanish tangled together, my accent thicker than ever because I couldn't think straight through the pain. She sighed, a long, exaggerated exhale, and looked at me like I was wasting her time. "You need to speak properly if you want me to understand you," she said, her tone sharp and impatient. I tried again, forcing myself to slow down, to focus on each word, but my voice shook and my accent was still there, unmistakable. "You can't even speak English right," she muttered, almost under her breath, but loud enough for me to hear. She didn't look at me when she said it, just kept fiddling with the machines like I was beneath her notice. Something inside me cracked, not broke, just cracked. A small fracture that let all the fear and pain and humiliation seep in. Tears started rolling down my cheeks, and I hated myself for it. Hated that I was crying in front of this woman who clearly didn't care. But I couldn't stop. The contractions kept coming, each one worse than the last, and I felt so alone, so small, so completely powerless. This was supposed to be one of the most important moments of my life, the birth of my child, and instead I was being treated like I didn't matter, like my pain was an inconvenience, like my accent made me less than human. Hours passed. I don't know how many. Time became meaningless, just an endless cycle of pain and fear and that nurse's cold, dismissive presence. She kept making little comments, small digs that probably sounded innocuous to anyone else but cut me deeply. "Try to relax," she'd say with a fake smile. "Or at least try to tell me what you're feeling without that ridiculous accent." I wanted to scream at her, wanted to tell her that I wasn't stupid, that I had come to this country with nothing and built a life, that I deserved respect. But the pain was so overwhelming that I could barely form coherent thoughts. I just wanted it to be over, wanted my baby to be born, wanted to get out of that room and never see that woman again. Then the door opened. Michael burst in, still in his uniform, his badge glinting under the harsh lights. He'd finally gotten my messages and had come as fast as he could. When he saw me, relief flooded his face, but then he noticed something was wrong. He saw the tears streaking my cheeks, the tension in my body, the way I was curled in on myself like I was trying to disappear. His eyes shifted to the nurse and I saw his expression change, concern hardening into something else, something protective and fierce. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice firm, authoritative, the voice he used when he was on duty. The nurse looked at him, and that's when she saw it. The badge, the uniform. Her face changed completely. The bored superiority vanished, replaced by panic, by the sudden realization that she'd miscalculated badly. "Officer?" she stammered, her voice suddenly small. I was only. "Only what?" Michael interrupted, his eyes fixed on her. "Why is my wife crying?" She didn't answer right away, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, trying to find words that would save her. But it was too late. Michael had already figured it out. He turned to me, took my hand in his touch gentle and warm. "You're okay now," he said softly. "I'm here." Then he looked back at the nurse and his voice dropped, cold and hard. "And you're going to explain to me exactly what happened here, or I'm going to speak to your supervisor right now. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Have you ever felt invisible, like your voice didn't matter? Drop the word heard in the comments if this story resonates with you. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. There's so much more to this story, and you won't want to miss what comes next." The nurse tried to explain herself, stammering out weak apologies that sounded more like excuses. "I didn't mean anything by it," she said, her voice shaking. "It's been a long shift. I'm stressed. Michael didn't let her finish. He stepped past her, opened the door, and called down the hallway. "I need a supervisor in here, now." Within minutes, another nurse appeared, older, with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor that was everything the first nurse wasn't. She took one look at the situation and her face darkened. "What happened?" she asked, directing the question at Michael but glancing at me with concern. Michael explained, his voice steady and controlled, but I could hear the anger underneath, carefully restrained. He told her about the comments, the dismissive attitude, the way I'd been treated like I didn't deserve basic human decency. The supervisor listened, her expression growing more serious with each word. When Michael finished, she turned to the first nurse. "Is this true?" The nurse tried to deny it at first, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, that she'd been professional, that I was just emotional because of the labor. But the supervisor wasn't buying it. "Wait outside," she said firmly. "We'll discuss this later." The nurse left, and I never saw her again. The supervisor apologized profusely, promising that I would receive the best care possible, that what happened was completely unacceptable, that there would be consequences. Then she brought in another nurse, someone warm and compassionate, who immediately made me feel safe. This nurse held my hand, spoke to me with respect and kindness, explained everything she was doing, and never once made me feel like my accent was a problem. With Michael by my side, and this new nurse caring for me, everything changed. The fear didn't go away completely, but it became manageable. The pain was still intense. But now I had support. I had someone holding my hand, telling me I was strong, that I could do this, and I did. Hours later, after what felt like an eternity of pushing and breathing and crying and fighting, my son was born, small, perfect, with a loud cry that filled the room and made my heart swell so much I thought it might burst. When they placed him in my arms, all the pain, all the humiliation, all the fear, it all disappeared. I looked at that tiny wrinkled face, his eyes squeezed shut, his little fists waving in the air, and I knew that everything I'd been through had been worth it. Michael stood beside me, tears streaming down his face, and we just stared at our son, overwhelmed by love and wonder. "You did it," Michael whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "You were so strong." I looked up at him. This man who had stood by me, who had protected me, who had fought for me when I couldn't fight for myself. And I felt a gratitude so deep it was almost painful. "We did it," I corrected him, and he smiled, leaning down to kiss my forehead. In the days that followed, I learned what had happened to the first nurse. There was a formal investigation. Other patients came forward with similar complaints, stories of dismissive treatment, of cruel comments, of a pattern of behavior that had been going on for months, maybe years. She was suspended pending the investigation, and eventually she was fired. Part of me felt satisfaction when I heard that. Not because I'm a vindictive person, but because it meant that what she did had consequences, that her cruelty hadn't been swept under the rug, that other patients wouldn't have to endure what I did. But mostly, I just wanted to move on. I wanted to focus on my family, on my baby, on the life we were building together. The first few months with my son were challenging in ways I hadn't expected. The sleepless nights, the constant feeding, the worry that came with every little cough or cry. But they were also the happiest months of my life. I learned to trust myself again, to believe that I was strong, that I was capable, that I deserved respect. My accent was still there, would always be there. And I started to see it differently, not as a flaw, not as something to be ashamed of, but as part of my story, part of who I am. It's proof of the journey I've taken, the courage it required to leave everything behind and start over in a place where I knew no one and didn't speak the language fluently. Michael reminded me of that constantly. "You're the bravest person I know," he'd say, holding our son while I tried to catch a few hours of sleep. "You came to a new country, learned a new language, built a life from nothing. That takes incredible strength." And he was right. I was strong. I had survived. And now, when I looked at my son, I saw a future full of possibilities. He would grow up knowing 2 cultures, speaking 2 languages, understanding that being different isn't a weakness, it's a gift. I wanted him to be proud of where he came from, to know his heritage, to never feel ashamed of who he is. Of course, life wasn't perfect. There were still moments when people treated me differently because of my accent, when I could see the judgment in their eyes, the assumption that I was less intelligent or less capable because I didn't sound like them. But now I knew better. I knew that their prejudice said more about them than it did about me. I had a family that loved me, a son who looked at me like I was the most important person in the world, and that was all that mattered. I also started speaking up more. When someone made a dismissive comment, instead of swallowing it and moving on, I started responding, calmly, firmly, but responding. "I speak 2 languages," I'd say. "How many do you speak?" It wasn't confrontational, just a statement of fact, but it usually shut people up. I realized that for too long I'd been letting other people's opinions define me, and I was done with that. I was done being small, done apologizing for who I am. One afternoon, when my son was about 6 months old, I was at the grocery store. He was in the cart, grinning at everyone who passed, and I was trying to navigate the aisles while juggling a shopping list. A woman, probably in her 60s, stopped to admire him. "He's beautiful," she said, smiling. "Thank you," I replied, my accent clear. Her smile faltered slightly, just a flicker of something in her eyes, but then she recovered. "Where are you from?" she asked. It's a question I get a lot, and it used to make me uncomfortable, like I had to justify my presence. But this time, I answered with pride. Originally, I'm from Latin America, but I live here now. This is my home. She nodded, and we chatted for a few more minutes about babies and sleepless nights and how fast they grow. When she walked away, I realized something had shifted. I didn't feel defensive anymore. I felt secure in who I am, where I come from, and where I'm going. As my son grew, I made a conscious effort to teach him about both sides of his heritage. We celebrated both American holidays and the traditions I grew up with. On Thanksgiving, we had turkey and mashed potatoes, but we also had my mother's recipes, the foods that reminded me of home. At Christmas, we put up a tree and hung stockings, but we also had a small nativity scene that my mother had sent, one that had been in our family for generations. I wanted him to know all of it, to understand that he didn't have to choose one identity over the other, that he could be both. Michael supported this completely. He learned some Spanish, stumbling over the words but trying earnestly, and he encouraged our son to speak both languages. He's lucky, Michael would say. He gets the best of both worlds. And he was right. Our son was lucky, but so was I. I was lucky to have found someone who saw me for who I truly am, who valued me not despite my differences, but because of them. Looking back on that night in the hospital, it still makes me angry. Not just for myself, but for everyone who has been treated that way, everyone who has been made to feel less than because of how they speak or where they come from. But I also see it as a turning point. It was the moment I stopped waiting for other people's approval and started demanding respect. It was the moment I realized that my voice matters, that my story matters, that I matter. So here we are now. My son is healthy, happy, thriving. He's starting to talk, babbling in this beautiful mix of English and Spanish that makes my heart swell. He has Michael's smile and my determination, and I know he's going to do amazing things. And me? I'm still learning, still growing, still figuring out who I am and who I want to be. But I know one thing for certain. I am enough, exactly as I am, with my accent, with my history, with all the parts of me that make me who I am. I am enough. If you're still watching, thank you for being here. This story isn't easy to tell, but it's important. We all deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, no matter where we come from or how we sound. And if you've experienced something similar, know that you're not alone. Now, the best part is coming next, so stay tuned. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. Your support means everything. The months turned into years, and life found its rhythm. My son grew from a baby into a toddler, running through the house with boundless energy, his laughter filling every corner. He was curious about everything, constantly asking questions in his mix of English and Spanish, and I did my best to answer them all. Michael and I settled into parenthood, learning as we went, making mistakes and learning from them, celebrating small victories like the first time our son slept through the night or took his first steps. But beyond the day-to-day routine of family life, something else was happening. I was changing, not in dramatic ways, but in small significant shifts that added up over time. I started volunteering at a local community center, helping other immigrants navigate the challenges I'd faced when I first arrived. I taught English classes, shared resources, offered support to people who felt lost and alone in this country. It was healing, in a way I hadn't expected. Every time I helped someone fill out a form or practice for a job interview or simply listen to their story, I felt like I was honoring my own journey. acknowledging how far I'd come. One woman I met, Maria, reminded me so much of myself when I first arrived. She was young, scared, homesick, working multiple jobs just to get by. Her English was rough and she was constantly second-guessing herself, apologizing for taking up space. I saw myself in her so clearly it was almost painful. So I took her under my wing, met with her every week, helped her practice English, connected her with job opportunities, and most importantly, reminded her that she was capable, that she was strong, that she belonged here just as much as anyone else. Watching her gain confidence, watching her start to believe in herself, was one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. Through this work, I also connected with other Latina women who had similar stories. Women who had left everything behind to build a better life, who had faced discrimination and hardship, who had been told in 1,000 different ways that they didn't belong. We formed a tight-knit group, meeting regularly to share our experiences, support each other, and celebrate our victories, no matter how small. These women became my chosen family, a network of strength and resilience that reminded me I was never truly alone. My relationship with Michael deepened too. Marriage isn't always easy, especially with the demands of work and raising a child, but we made it a priority to stay connected. We had date nights, even if they were just quiet dinners at home after our son went to bed. We talked, really talked, about our hopes and fears and dreams. Michael continued to be my biggest supporter, always encouraging me to pursue my passions, to use my voice, to never dim my light for anyone. And I supported him too, understanding the weight of his job, the stress he carried, the difficult things he saw and couldn't always talk about. There were still challenges, of course. Money was sometimes tight, work was stressful, parenting was exhausting, and yes, there were still moments when I faced prejudice, when someone made a comment about my accent or treated me like I didn't belong. But now, I had the tools to deal with it. I had confidence, I had a community, I had a family that loved me unconditionally. And most importantly, I had learned to love myself. One day, when my son was about 3 years old, we went back to that hospital. Not for an emergency, just for a routine checkup. As we walked through those halls, I felt a surge of complicated emotions. This was the place where my son was born, where I experienced some of the worst moments of my life, but also where I became a mother, where everything changed. I wondered if I would see that nurse, the one who had been so cruel. Part of me hoped I wouldn't, but part of me also wanted to show her that I had survived, that I had thrived, that her words hadn't broken me. We didn't see her, but we did see the supervisor, the one who had intervened that night. She recognized me immediately. "How are you?" she asked, her smile genuine. "I think about you sometimes. Wonder how you're doing." I introduced her to my son, who was hiding shyly behind my legs, and told her we were doing well, better than well. She seemed genuinely happy to hear it. "I'm so glad," she said, "and I want you to know, what happened that night, it led to some significant changes here. We implemented new training for all staff on cultural sensitivity and patient respect. Your experience, as awful as it was, it made a difference." I hadn't known that. I felt a mix of emotions, sadness, that it had taken my pain to create change, but also a strange sense of purpose. Maybe something good had come from that terrible night after all. As we left the hospital that day, my son held my hand and looked up at me with those big, trusting eyes. "Mama, where were we?" he asked. "This is where you were born," I told him. "This is where you came into the world. and it was the best day of my life." He thought about that for a moment, then smiled. "I'm glad I was born, Mama." "Me too, baby," I said, squeezing his hand. "Me too." Time continued to pass. My son started preschool, making friends, learning, growing. I watched him navigate the world with a confidence I'd had to fight so hard to find, and it filled me with pride and hope. He was comfortable in both languages, switching between English and Spanish effortlessly, and he never seemed to question his identity the way I had. To him, being bilingual and bicultural was just normal, just who he was. I also started writing, nothing formal, just journaling at first, getting my thoughts and feelings down on paper. But then I started sharing some of my writing with my community group, and they encouraged me to do more with it. So I started a blog, writing about my experiences as an immigrant, as a mother, as someone navigating life between two cultures. It was terrifying at first, putting my story out there for anyone to read. But it was also liberating. People responded, sharing their own stories, thanking me for giving voice to experiences they'd had but never been able to articulate. It felt like I was building something, creating a space where people like me could be seen and heard. Michael was incredibly proud. "You're making a difference," he'd tell me. "You're helping people." And maybe I was. Or maybe I was just trying to make sense of my own journey, trying to find meaning in the struggles I'd faced. Either way, it felt important. It felt right. One evening, I was putting my son to bed when he asked me a question that caught me off guard. "Mama, why do you talk different than Daddy?" I paused, choosing my words carefully. "Because I grew up in a different place, where people speak a different language. My accent is part of who I am, part of my story." He thought about that, his little face serious. "I like how you talk," he said. "It sounds pretty." My eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, baby. That means a lot to me." He hugged me tight, then rolled over and fell asleep within minutes, the way only children can. But I sat there for a long time, watching him breathe, feeling overwhelmed with love and gratitude. This little person, this beautiful, perfect little person, he saw me completely, and he loved me exactly as I am. Years passed. My son grew from a toddler into a child, curious and kind and full of life. Our family expanded in other ways too, not with more children, but with deeper connections, more friends, a stronger community. I continued my volunteer work, my writing, my journey of self-discovery. And through it all, I held on to the lessons I'd learned that night in the hospital, that I am worthy of respect, that my voice matters, that I deserve to take up space in this world. There were still hard days, of course. Days when I missed my family back home so much it physically hurt. Days when I felt like an outsider, caught between two worlds and fully belonging to neither. Days when the weight of everything I'd been through felt almost too heavy to carry. But on those days I looked at my son, at Michael, at the life we'd built together, and I reminded myself why I'd done this, why it had all been worth it. I also stayed in touch with my family back home, video calls every week, sending money when I could, planning visits when possible. My mother was so proud of me, proud of the life I'd created, proud of her grandson who she'd only met a handful of times but loved fiercely. "You did it," she told me once, her voice crackling through the phone line. "You made it." And I had. Not in some grand dramatic way, but in the quiet, persistent way that real life unfolds. I had survived. I had built a home. I had created a family. I had found my voice. So what do you think? Have you ever faced discrimination or felt like you had to prove your worth because of who you are or where you're from? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story matters just as much as mine. And if this story touched you, please subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. There are more stories coming, stories that will inspire you, challenge you, and remind you that you're not alone. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.